Greetings, this is Matt Fiello, Technical Marketing Engineer with the Cisco Cloud Networking Compute BU, and we're back with another Intersight Managed Mode Expert Series video. This video is a little bit different. We're not just focusing on a policy, okay? It's not quick and dirty. This is a longer video. It's use case driven. We're going to talk about firmware upgrades. Not only in Intersight managed mode, I thought it would be prudent to go ahead and throw in UCSM managed mode, Standalone C-Series, as well as the connected and private virtual appliances. So this video's got a lot of content. There's going to be a lot of slides. There's like 3 different demonstrations, and I've compartmentalized everything so that you have your choice. If you're new, you might want to go wire to wire. Get a hot cup of coffee or beverage of choice, kick back and watch it, and hopefully you learn something. If you're already pretty knowledgeable about this kind of stuff, you might want to just cherry pick and go in and go to the section that most interests you. Either way, I hope you're able to learn something from this video. And with that, let's get on with the slides and the demonstrations that are mixed in. In talking first about IMM firmware upgrades, which entail the fabric interconnect, your B or X series blades, plus any FI managed C-Series. C-Series servers are directly cabled to the FI, or they're going through a 2232 FEX as an example, and then cabled from the FEX over to the FI. In the case of the fabric interconnect, the infrastructure, you're doing direct endpoint upgrades. You're just using the workflow within the UX to pick the firmware bundle and basically push that firmware down to the FIs, and of course, activate and acknowledge the reboot of the FIs, which happen individually. Okay, to upgrade the FIs. When it comes to the servers, you also have that option, BRX series servers or the FI managed C-Series servers. I can push the firmware from the UI, from an action, engage the workflow, the automation, push that down to the server. And I have, as a possible use case, maybe the initial setup of a UCS domain. So when you set up a brand new UCS domain and you claim it to Intersight, you're only seeing the 2 FIs, so you might wish to upgrade the FIs at that time if they have older code. And then once you create the domain policies and the domain profile and you deploy that down to those FIs, to that domain, then a discovery of the chassis and servers will ensue. So suddenly you're going to see your servers. You may not have at that time built out your policy model for the server side, okay, or server profile templates and server profiles. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and do direct endpoint upgrades on the servers at that time, that's your choice, and you have the speed of doing that. But most customers will opt for ongoing operations option 2, and that is to build a firmware policy. So after you have your server policy model built out, server profile templates, server profiles, you can build a firmware policy. You can attach that firmware policy to your server profile template or the server profile, and then deploy. And you have the option to activate immediately, okay, reboot immediately after the server profile is deployed down, firmware is deployed down, and then the activate will make that firmware come up on the server, right, properly. Or you can simply choose to push the firmware down, stage it, okay, and then subsequently after the fact at some point in time reboot the server. Couple points here. The firmware deployment will be skipped if it's determined to match what already exists on the endpoint. So if you have a firmware policy and the firmware is already on the endpoint, it's going to skip that deployment. Okay, and also a firmware policy attached to a server profile deployed down to a server okay, is going to preclude you from doing direct endpoint upgrades. Okay, it should be grayed out in the UX, and that's because you got a firmware policy in your server profile and it's been deployed. So of course, with Intersight Managed Mode, we have three form factors. We have the Intersight SAS, of course, in which case the firmware is downloaded directly from Intersight, staged down to the Fabric Interconnect. Okay, so it becomes resident on the Fabric Interconnect. Then we have the appliance connected virtual appliance flavor, and that's tethered back to Intersight SAS. So while the firmware is downloaded from Intersight SAS to the CVA, it doesn't persist on the CVA. It passes through to the Fabric Interconnect. Okay. And then we have the private virtual appliance. That necessitates a manual download on a public network that's accessible, uh, assuming that your PVA is on either a classified network or a compartmented network. You're going to do a manual download of the firmware. You got to transition it over to the private, okay, or classified side, and then physically manually upload it to the appliance, okay, because the appliance is air gapped. It doesn't have any connectivity back to Intersight SAS. Okay, so in that case, you're going to upload that firmware to the appliance itself, and it will stay resident on that appliance. Okay, and then you can drive the firmware upgrade, okay, to the Fabric Interconnect, and it gets staged down to the Fabric Interconnect. Okay, and with Intersight Managed Mode, direct endpoint upgrades, okay, we're going to, again, leverage the workflow automation built into Intersight to download the firmware to the Fabric Interconnects and to the servers, okay, and we've already talked about a possible use case. There is a new option, fairly new option, introduced into Intersight to singularly upgrade a UCS fabric one at a time. Okay, this was a request from a couple customers, and we built this in. So what that means is you're not upgrading in both fabrics in one single workflow. You're doing them individually. So in the first fabric upgrade, you're pushing the firmware down to the Fabric Interconnect. And of course, that gets synced to both Fabric Interconnects. So that firmware push only goes once. But then the first Fabric Interconnect is going to perform basically an upgrade capability. So it stages it down to the IOMs, IFMs in those chassis. That will not occur, of course, on the subordinate. That's really not subordinate. The both FIs and IMM mode are the same level. There's no primary, secondary, so to speak. But that does not occur on the second Fabric Interconnect. Okay, so we're not touching anything downstream. In which case you'll complete the first upgrade and activation of the fabric, and you can check everything out, and then you perform the operation on the second fabric. And of course, you have to remember to go do that. Okay, we don't want it to be persisting for a great length of time that you have two fabric interconnects not on the same version of firmware. So you'll need to pay attention to that. Okay, a couple things here. The endpoints will always be upgraded. Okay, so if you're doing a direct endpoint upgrade to servers, okay, even if the version matches and you continue to drive through the workflow, it will still push. Now on the policy side, it will skip if the version's the same. Okay, but when you're doing the direct endpoint and you're saying, I want you to upgrade, okay, it's going to do that. A firmware policy does preclude you from performing endpoint upgrades. So if you do have a firmware policy part of a server profile and you deployed it down to the server, then direct endpoint upgrades are going to be grayed out for you in the UX. All right, so that's the reason. And then I just want to comment that we are working on scheduling these types of operations. Okay, so that's something you can look forward to in the future. In talking about Intersight Managed Mode server firmware policy upgrades. So we're using firmware policies and server profiles. Um, the firmware policy allows for greater standardization across many servers out there. So, you can attach a firmware policy to a template. I can have 100 server profiles bound to that template, and then I'm assured that the same firmware is applied to those servers. So it's been our observation over time in the life of UCS that most customers use firmware policies. Now, when you attach a policy to a server profile or template, you must then, of course, redeploy that server profile to each and every server. So the firmware is staged down to the server, and then in conjunction, before you actually say go, in the deployment of that server profile, you have the option to activate immediately, meaning I'm going to push the serverware down, and I'm going to immediately reboot the server and make that firmware active all in one operation. Okay. Or you can choose not to reboot immediately and simply push the firmware down, stage it at the server level, and then perhaps maybe at a time later in a maintenance window, go ahead and reboot that server. The firmware policy does support a multi-model capability. Okay, in other words, I can build a firmware policy with up to 6 different server PID firmware version combinations. Okay, so don't know that you'll have 6 different server models to contend with in your organization, but certainly not everybody's homogeneous. You have more than one M6s, M7s, M5s, whatever, and you can pick the appropriate combination and have that be in one policy, and then of course use that one policy across multiple server profile templates, server profiles. Okay. A couple notes here. If you've mistakenly deployed the wrong firmware down to the server and you have not activated it yet, then you can simply make a correction on the firmware policy and repush, and it will write over, okay, what was previously deployed down. If you've also deployed firmware down to the server and it's not been activated and you wish to cancel, maybe you just say, hey, no, timeout. We don't really want to do this. Okay. Then you can simply take away the firmware policy, okay, and redeploy the server profile down again to the server, and that will cancel out the any possible firmware upgrade. Okay, and further solidifying deploying firmware with a server profile, okay, via the firmware policy. Okay, we are going to do a check on the version, okay, and we will upgrade the component in the server. Internally there's a comparison going on. Okay, so if an impact is not detected, in other words, everything is adjudicated to be the same, okay, then we would not perform any operation. And you'll see that because you can deploy your server profile with a new upgraded firmware the first time, and it will upgrade. And then thereafter, if you took the server profile detached, okay, and then redeployed, then you'll see that firmware push is going to get skipped in the task flow. Okay. Now, if an impact is detected, okay, because you generally have attached a firmware version that's greater than or even lesser than if it's a downgrade, okay, then we're going to download the bundle from Intersight to the FI, okay, copy the bundles to the peer node of the FI. Okay, so everything's consistent between the FIs. Check, reachability from the server to the FI, and then stage the firmware upgrade. Okay. Now that after the deployment part of it is complete, then we're going to activate. Okay. And again, as we have alluded to, you can have that activation occur in conjunction. So after the deployment is complete, firmware stage down, the server automatically reboots, or you can simply choose to not activate at time of SP deployment, deploy the SP down with the firmware, have it staged at the endpoint, and then simply at a later time, desired time, reboot the server. And just a final point here, on completion of this process, okay, the server will be left in a powered on state. Okay, so if the server was powered off initially, then it's going to power on. You're going to power cycle the server, and it's going to be on. You're going to upgrade the firmware, okay, and then it's going to be left in a power on state. Okay, so a final slide here on performing firmware policy upgrades with the server profile for older M5 generation servers in the original California chassis, 5108 chassis. The Intersight HSU firmware doesn't include the VIC firmware for that particular older generation of servers. So most customers won't realize this. It'll be pretty innocuous and transparent, but attention to detail, if you look at the task flow, you will see that Intersight steps in and does perform the VIC adapter upgrade as part of that upgrade workflow. And as far as activation goes, there's no change from previous activations. Okay, I wanted to include a few slides talking about Intersight Managed Mode, FIs and firmware bundles, and managing that on the FIs, on the FI, excuse me. This information is actually taken out of Intersight help, okay, and troubleshooting different things. So I'll include that link in the comments section after I post this video. It'll be one of several different links I include. But you should keep track of your FI storage, okay? And here are the parameters, okay? So you need, for instance, 90% free space in var temp. Okay, so it's a good idea to stay abreast of this. You don't want to keep downloading all these different firmwares and have these different system kind of file directories fill up. Okay, so this is the limitations right here. And as we talked about those limitations, this is actually where you're going to look at the fabric interconnects in Intersight. So you're an infrastructure service, you click on the fabric interconnects, you click on the individual fabric interconnect and go to inventory. And then at the bottom there, you see local storage, and you see the amount of space being used. So the restrictions is how much free, but yet we're showing in this screen here how much is used. So I'll get with the docs team and have them flip that around in the documentation. Okay, so it's apples to apples. But this is where you check. Now, as far as deleting unused, unneeded firmware bundles in the Intersight Managed Mode FI, um, unlike UCS Manager, you can't just go in and see all the bundles in the UX and right-click and delete, which you do not want to have any longer, older firmware. But it's nevertheless, it's very easy to do. You just secure shell into the Fabric Interconnect, and from the main menu, from the prompt, just list dash firmware dash cache. And that's going to list out all the firmwares that are resident on the Fabric Interconnect. And you'll notice that the middle column here is a certain ID here. So the command to actually clear that out, that particular bundle, okay, is clear dash firmware dash cache, and then follow that with the specific identifier. And then after a confirmation, you're going to delete that. So one operation on a fabric interconnect, it will delete on the opposite fabric interconnect, as you would expect. Okay, so final word about Intersight Managed Mode firmware operations. I just wanted to include a simple graphic here showing Intersight SaaS, intersight.com, for anything directly connected to SaaS. Okay, so I got my Intersight Managed Mode domain down here on the left, B series or X series, or managed C-Series. Okay, that are connected to the FIs. I'm just going to download straight from intersight.com. If you're on the right side here, then you've got the appliance. I'm showing the connected virtual appliance here because of the tether. Private virtual appliance. Again, there's no tether to Intersight, so you have to do everything manual. You have to download on the public and then upload to the appliance. So the appliance stores the firmware. Okay, CVA is not. going to store the firmware. It's going to pass through. Okay, so as you order up a firmware upgrade, either infrastructure for the FIs or a B or X series or FI managed C-Series server upgrade, okay, it's gonna request the firmware be downloaded, pass through the appliance, and then down to the domain, okay, down resident on the FIs, and then subsequently upgrading the blades. Point of order here is that firmware download is only going to occur one time. Obviously, it's being cached in the fabric interconnects, and it'll be resident in the fabric interconnects. So the first time you do one blade, okay, it's going to do this operation, download operation. Thereafter, the other 64, however many blades you got, is going to simply use what's there resident on the fabric interconnect to upgrade. Okay, so here we are doing our first demonstration, and this demonstration is going to be Intersight Managed Mode Based IMM. Okay, so here I am in SAS, Intersight SAS, and if I go to my Fabric Interconnects, and this one is my domain, the Bravo 26. I'm going to click on that. And as far as looking at local storage goes, before I do a firmware operation, you go to inventory and then local storage. Okay, and again, this is the space being used, whereas the documentation lists out the required free space. Okay, so just take note of that. I'm not going to go log in secure shell in because I provided the slide in the presentation, so that's too easy. But you should keep your eye on these if you're getting close, and go in and clean up some of those old firmwares. There's no reason for them to be there if you're not running that firmware in the primary or in the backup. Let's go back here, and of course we can invoke a upgrade operation from within the fabric interconnect, and we can also do that from one screen back. I can select it here, go to the pull down, upgrade firmware. Okay, so that starts the upgrade firmware wizard. Okay, and it picks the correct your FI here and all the parameters that you would want to see as far as the existing version. The single fabric interconnect upgrade. Okay, this allows you to pick one or the other, the A or the B, and just perform a single upgrade on that FI. Now, we're going to push the firmware down from Intersight to the fabric interconnect, and it's going to hit the fabric interconnect, and it's going to go across the L1 and L2 cables, and it's going to sync to the opposite fabric interconnect. That's going to happen. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to do any type of upgrade and activate on the opposite fabric interconnect. So in other words, if I start this process out with A, then I am only going to be updating and activating, okay, the A fabric interconnect. And when that is done, okay, then I'm still going to have to go back and do this operation again, and then next time select B. Now the firmware is already resident on the FI because it was synced across, okay, but what we're doing is precluding touching any IOMs on both fabrics at the same time, IFMs, etc. So again, probably a smaller sampling of customers would do this, but it's there. It's use it at your leisure. The only warning is don't forget to upgrade the second fabric interconnect. Don't get distracted. Do one, think you're done, and then be running mixed firmware for any given length of time outside of an upgrade window. Okay. All right. So we're not going to do that. And I'm going to click next. Okay. So again, we're connected to Intersight SAS. Okay. And if I go to advanced mode, I have the option to disable uh, FI traffic evacuation. Okay. So if I'm in a lab, I'm not upgrading production servers, production infrastructure plus servers. Maybe I'm doing an initial setup to get it ready for production. Then I don't want to really mess around with fabric evacuation. You can disable that. Okay, but it's on by default. You have to go to the advanced mode here to see that setting. Okay, and then as you can see, we have our different firmware bundles that's applicable only to a 6454 in my case. Okay, so you're only going to see the firmware that's applicable to your given PID, okay, for Fabric Interconnect. And if you select this and click next, and I happen to know I'm already upgraded to this version, so that's what this check mark is telling me. What I don't like, and I'm trying to get changed, okay, is firmware versions are found same, hence no impact. Well, it's no impact as far as you're going to end up with the same firmware. But the fact of the matter is, if you hit this upgrade button, you're now going to push that firmware down, and it's going to be disruptive to each fabric interconnect as you acknowledge it, right? So I don't want somebody to think that just because it says hence no impact that you're going to go ahead and click upgrade and it's just going to figure it out and not push. Okay, it's going to do basically a no op, okay, or a skip type functionality. That does not occur when you do direct endpoint upgrades to FIs, and it doesn't occur either when you do it to servers. Okay, now later when we show the firmware policy, if the firmware policy determines that the endpoint is the same version, then we're not going to push the firmware policy and package that up in the server profile deployment redeployment. Okay, we'll skip that. Okay, so there's a difference in behavior between direct endpoint upgrades, okay, and um, firmware policy upgrades, which particularly on the server side. Okay, but I just want you to understand that this message is kind of misleading, hence no impact. Okay, so I'm not going to actually do this. I'm already upgraded, and I'm not going to burn time with grass growing for this to complete. But that's simple enough. And of course, from a server perspective, we can go to servers. I like to filter down. So these are my X series servers. Okay, so in this case, if I select my X series server here, you'll see that it's grayed out. Upgrade firmware for direct endpoint upgrades. It's grayed out because I have a server profile deployed to that server that includes a firmware policy. Okay. Now, if I didn't have a server profile deployed, you know, server number 3 here, okay, I have the capability to upgrade firmware. Also, if I go over here to my C-Series servers, okay, if I select the first one, they both have server profiles, right? What's up? It's got a server profile. I can upgrade firmware. Well, that's because this server profile, okay, doesn't have a firmware policy assigned to it. Okay, so that's another thing. I can have a server profile deployed to the server. I just can't have a firmware policy attached to that server profile. So let's go back and let's go to servers and go back to the C-Series. Okay, and as you can see with this one here, if I try to upgrade, it's grayed out. Okay, it just so happens that SP2 here has a firmware policy. Okay, so that's the behavior, just FYI. Okay, let's go to policy and look at policies. Okay, so here's my server policies. And let's go down here and look at that firmware policy. I'm going to open this guy up and edit this guy. Go to the second screen. Okay, and you can see, I can have up to 6 server models here. So I have my X Series M6, X Series M7, and they have different firmware versions, slightly different. Okay, and also a rack mount C220 M6 that I have as part of my UCS domain. In other words, they're directly cabled in. Okay, so in other words, I've got the flexibility with this firmware policy to use this across the board in multiple templates, and it depends on how you do it. Some customers build templates based on the model or the PID of the server. Okay. There's many ways of doing things, so I'm not trying to dictate a best practice, but you can use a pretty all-in-one inclusive policy to manage a bunch of different server type, firmware type combinations. Okay. So I just want to point out also, um, if we go over here to Intersight, the connected virtual appliance. Let me log in. All right, so I can go to my fabric interconnects. Okay, again, if I want to upgrade that fabric interconnect, this one happens to be a 6536. I can upgrade the firmware. I am tethered to Intersight. Okay, I can click next. And of course, I've already deployed that version. So the same thing. The only thing here is the firmware is downloaded to the appliance, then downloaded to the fabric interconnects through the appliance. Okay, and it's stored again on the fabric interconnects. If I go to the servers here and let's go ahead and select this one, M7, upgrade there, click next, select the firmware bundle. Okay, and that's already been previously deployed. Okay, but again, if I hit the upgrade, we're going to push this out again. Now, if I go here to the system and I go to software repository, there's only four categories up here. We have the firmware links. So I have the firmware links that I can add a link uh, for um, for standalone C-Series servers. And that's another thing here. This firmware link, I almost wish we'd put C-Series here because that's what it's for. Okay, you're not going to use this for anything except standalone C-Series firmware, and you can provide the local repo. You can upload the HUU that you download from software.cisco.com to the local repo and then build a link there. We'll do that later. But I want to compare and contrast that if we pop over to the the PVA. Okay, so we've got the private appliance here. Let's go to system and software repository, and you got this category, you got this tab here, software files. So this is your local repo. Okay, you still have the external link for C-Series, but all the firmware gets uploaded here. Okay, B infrastructure, B X series, FI managed C-Series, as well as uh, a capability of doing standalone here as well. Okay, for standalone server, but then I can also use a firmware link and leverage a local or site specific repo in case my appliance is not in the same location. Okay, so in a PVA world, you're not connected to the outside. You're going to be downloading firmware and uploading to the appliance. So that completes our demonstration for an IMM uh, firmware operations across the different platforms. All right, so we're going to change gears a bit here, and now we're not talking about Intersight Managed Mode, IMM, which is the one mode of setting up a fabric interconnect pair, but now we're talking about UMM, and that stands for UCS Managed Mode. Okay, so we're using UCS Manager still, but we're able to then claim up to Intersight. So we're still talking about Intersight, okay, but you got UCS Manager in the picture. Okay, so some things are different, of course. Again, talking about SAS and CVA here, you're still going to be able to see a list of the images. It's inventoried, it's presented to you, so the correct FI infrastructure firmware is presented, the correct blade firmware is presented. So there's an added benefit of having that reduced filtered set of firmware at your kind of disposal, at your beck and call. So you can drive these firmware upgrades from a single pane of glass. Um, and it will absolutely appear when you select, and you can select what version then as you do the wizard for the upgrade. Um, so when you do select the upgrade and you initiate, the images are downloaded to the endpoint. So it's going to come down to either directly to the fabric interconnect itself, or if you're in an appliance, connected virtual appliance, and you're tethered back to Intersight, okay, in system software repository, you won't see any local repository then for firmware for the CVA. That's because it's assuming you have tethered connection, you have access to Intersight. So everything is just passed through, go through the CVA, okay, and then down to the fabric interconnect where it does get cached. All right. And of course, we drew that difference in a prior slide. The PVA actually has a local file store directory where it does cache the firmware store the firmware on the PVA. That's because you have to manually download externally and then upload. Okay. Um, so there's no firmware policy in Intersight because we're not in IMM mode for UMM servers. Okay, so it's direct endpoint upgrades only from Intersight. Okay, but of course, you still have UCS Manager. So if you wish to go that route, you can use UCS Manager, use firmware policies in UCS Manager, and redeploy your service profiles. Make sure I say the right thing, service profiles in UCS Manager, redeploy those to upgrade your servers. So your choice. Okay, so we've touched on the majority of this already, but we'll highlight this again. So now we're talking about the private virtual appliance. We have UCS domains in UCSM mode, UMM mode, claimed to the private virtual appliance. Okay, so you have to, of course, download the firmware bundles externally and then upload to the PVA. Okay, and you're going to upload that to your system software repository, and you'll see that the bundles are stored there. This is the private virtual appliance, completely air gapped, so we're going to store the bundles there after you do the upload. Okay, the firmware will appear as you do an upgrade wizard, either for the infrastructure or for the servers. Okay. Um, as far as a firmware policy, you're in UCSM mode. You're in UCS manager mode. So there's no concept of Intersight firmware. That's IMM. There's no concept of a firmware policy because that's IMM, right? So in this case, you're using UCS Manager. You can either do a direct endpoint upgrade of your servers from the PVA, from Intersight, which is the PVA, okay. Or if you wish to use policy, of course, you can use a firmware policy in UCS Manager, attach that to the server profile, redeploy the server profile, and push the firmware down to the blade. Okay, so for demo number 2, we're focusing on firmware operations in UMM mode, UCSM managed mode. In other words, UCS domains managed by UCS Manager aboard the FIs, aboard that ASIC, but they're claimed to Intersight, and you wish to drive your firmware upgrades from within Intersight. Now, in my case, for this demonstration here, I'm actually going to show you from the private virtual appliance. So I'm air gapped on this. So of course, there's some additional downloads and uploads necessary to get that firmware stationed, positioned, staged on the private virtual appliance to perform an upgrade. So if I look here, okay, and go to System and Targets, you can see that I have a UCSM managed domain here. Okay. If I go to the software repository, okay, you can see that we have software files. We have a local repo on the appliance itself. Now, the firmware links is for Standalone C-Series, so something else right now. This is UMM, UCSM mode, so your B series servers, your X series servers, right? Your fabric interconnect infrastructure firmware, your C-Series FI managed firmware, things like that that you would be uploading, downloading from Software Central. Okay, basically download those. And by the way, the X series is in with the B series firmware. So think B for blades. Okay, still the B package. Um, but you're going to have to download what you need from there, transfer it across, and then upload with the upload operation here to the appliance. And as you can see here, I've got my 6400 bundle for 433 alpha, the A bundle. So that's my infrastructure. Okay, that's my system and kickstart for the FIs. That's my UCS manager version. That's the IOM firmware. And then I have my B series bundle, 433 alpha B. Okay, or X if I had an X series chassis as part of UCS manager. Okay, so let's go back to infrastructure. And if I go to fabric interconnects and I click a fabric interconnect, upgrade firmware, okay, everything's the same. Click next, but I only see that one bundle because again, this is the private virtual appliance. I'm only seeing what I uploaded to the local software repo, okay, which was one firmware bundle. If this was the connected virtual appliance, I'd be tethered to Intersight and I'd see a bunch of different versions of firmware in here. Okay, or if you're on SaaS, you see a bunch of firmware versions in here as well. Okay, so I'm not going to actually do an upgrade, but we'll click next. And then you can see that this is the same firmware version. So I've already got this installed on the Fabric Interconnects. It's telling me that, but if I do hit upgrade, it's going down again. And you're going to be rebooting both your Fabric Interconnects on the user X. Okay, so just a warning. Let's cancel out of this and let's go to our servers. So I've got a whole chassis full of B200 M5s. Okay, and I can multi-select. Okay, maybe these are hypervisors and I have a ton of capacity and I offloaded all the VMs, or I'm just setting up initially. Okay, and I'm not running anything as far as production. I can multi-select. Okay, I can go the dots here, breadcrumbs here, go to the top, do that, upgrade firmware. They're all selected. Click next. Okay, there's the one bundle that I've uploaded to the appliance, okay, to the directory. Okay, and then I can click next and basically choose to upgrade. Okay, again, regardless of what version is installed, and this would actually be an upgrade here. Okay, it's going to be pushed down to the blades. Okay, so with that, I think we've covered everything I wanted to touch on with UCSM managed mode. So that completes demonstration number 2. Okay, so we find ourselves switching gears yet again, and now we're talking about Intersight Standalone C-Series. So no fabric interconnects in the pictures here. Standalone rack servers directly claimed to Intersight. Okay, particularly the SAS and CVA on this slide here. So we can directly download the firmware from Intersight and install, and that's repeated on each and every server. So you can do singularly, or you can mass select for multiple operations. Okay. Alternatively, though, you can download from software.cisco.com, you can download the host update utility for standalone C-Series servers. Okay. And you can position that and stage that on a local file repo, a local file directory on an adjacent server. Okay. And you simply build the firmware link within Intersight so that when you initiate the firmware upgrade, the server points to the file directory to grab the firmware and download the firmware from there to the target server. Okay. Firmware will still appear, as always, in the select version of the wizard. Okay. It's downloaded directly to the C-Series server. Okay. And also, for those in the standalone C-Series world, Intersight does support firmware policies and server profiles for standalone servers. So you still could, even in a standalone server world, you could still use your server profile. You could still build the firmware policy for that server profile and use that as the transport, as the vehicle to upgrade your server. So you have options. Okay, now talking about the private virtual appliance for standalone C-Series servers, the air-gapped version of the appliance. Okay, again, you're going to download the host update utility from software.cisco.com and then physically transfer that to your private network and then upload to the PVA appliance where there is a file store. So it will be resident on the PVA. Alternatively, okay, you can download the host update utility and then position it out there on a local site file directory, okay, and then build a firmware link to that where that file is hosted, okay, for the server then in the workflow to reach out to the file directory to download to the endpoint server, right? And then do the firmware upgrade. So the advantage of firmware links is your PVA might be in one data center, it might be in one geography, in one site, and that's fine for upgrading the servers that are in close proximity, but you might have distant sites or alternate sites, right? You don't want to necessarily be dragging the firmware bundle across and deploying it across a wide area link. So establish a local share, okay, one or more for your different sites, and then you can position and stage the server firmware there where it's in close proximity on a high-speed network to the server. So that's the idea. Okay, some additional notes here about standalone C-Series upgrades with Intersight. So there's basically three ways you can upgrade firmware. Okay, of course, the direct endpoint upgrade. That's where you're using the Cisco repository in Intersight. So that affords you that capability from SAS and CVA. Okay. Caveats here for M4, M5 servers. You must have utility storage on the server to do this type of upgrade, direct endpoint upgrade. Okay. Um, Firmware gets downloaded to that utility storage. Now the M4 uses SD cards, and those are often split into OS and utilities. Okay, whereas the M5 uses FlexUtil. Okay, those must be resident on the server, and it's an option. So not all of those servers out there have utility storage. Now, if you're talking M6, M7, the newer stuff, the newer servers, we went to a different mechanism. We use the onboard MMC's flash, okay, and that comes with the server. That's not an option. It's built in. All right, so there's no worries about the worry of needing utility storage. It's already there, and that's what we're using to upgrade the firmware. Now, you can have a direct point upgrade, but doing the remote site software repositories. That's where we're building firmware links. We've talked about that, right? Okay. And if you have an older server, M4, M5, and you don't have utility storage on those servers, you can absolutely still use the direct endpoint, but you have to host the firmware on a remote or site-specific data store file directory and provide the firmware link. So this is your only saving grace if you're trying to upgrade an M4, M5 server with Intersight, and you don't have the utility storage aboard. Okay, and finally, you can use a firmware policy with a server profile. Okay, so I can build a firmware policy in Intersight. I can attach that to my server profile and then deploy that down to the server. But again, if you were to use M4 or M5 to do that, you would have to have utility storage. Okay, not a problem with M6 and M7. Okay, so I provided another graphic here of UCSM managed mode and standalone C-Series firmware operation as far as the firmware pathing goes, where it gets downloaded from. And I'll confess the graphic is actually today, as I record this, it's just a little bit more complicated because we're merging some things on the back end, completely nebulous to customers. Okay, so this is how it's going to be. Okay, and so your firmware download operations will be coming from Intersight proper. Okay, there's no back-end connection. There won't be a future back-end connection to ASD as an example. Okay. So here I got standalone C-Series servers claimed directly to Intersight, bottom left here, and then of course I've got my local hosted image as well, my file store that I can leverage that for my host update utilities, and base my firmware upgrades from that. And then we have UCSM managed mode BX series, and then FI managed C series directly connected to Intersight. And then on the right side that we show the appliance, the connected virtual appliance that's tethered, okay, to Intersight SaaS. And of course, it's downloading this firmware from intersight.com, okay, and it's passing through the CVA and going straight to the fabric interconnects, okay, um, in UCSM mode. As far as standalone C series, it's passing down to either the standalone C series server, or you can choose to download the HUU and upload that then to a local file store, a local directory. Okay, so for the third demo, we're going to focus on standalone C-Series firmware operations. And for this demo, I'm actually on my connected virtual appliance that's tethered to SAS. Okay, so let's go to targets, or actually system and targets, and you can see I have a standalone M5 server here. Okay, I'm going to go to the software repo, and there's no local repo because we're tethered to the SaaS cloud, right? So I'm going to be able to see all my firmware packages from Intersight. That's if I want to download for each server, download from SaaS. Okay, you might not want to do that for a lot of standalone C-Series servers. So we give you the option of adding a firmware link to a local repo. So I'm going to do that. I'm actually going to use something called the IMM transition tool. Okay, its forte is converting UCSM and UCS Central policy models, okay, into IMM policy models. That's why they call it the IMM transition tool. So we're not really demoing that today. But if you download this is free and deploy it. It takes less than 5 minutes. It's an OVA. Give it an IP address, admin password, log in, okay, and go to this third tab down. You're going to have, by default, 100 gigs of HTTPS storage where you can put firmware files, ISOs, both for the host update utility to update servers, as well as um, operating system ISOs, okay, and SCU ISOs that you use in conjunction with deploying the operating system. So this comes in real handy. Um, and all you have to do is click New, File Upload, and you can drag and drop your ISO, and it uploads to the tool. Okay, once there, then we can simply just go to the share link, copy the share link, and now um, I'm going to go back to my connected virtual appliance, specifically system software repository, and I'm going to add a firmware link. It's going to be http:/s. I'm going to paste in that link I copied, click Next. Okay, I'm satisfied with the information it's filled out here, click Add. All right, so now we have a firmware link that is for the C220 M5 servers, and we'll be able to access that. So if I go to System and Infrastructure Service, and I go back to Servers, and I select that C220 M5, and I decide to do a firmware upgrade operation, okay, select it, click Next. Notice that because I'm on the CVA, I do have visibility to the software Cisco repository that's in SaaS Cloud. I do have that. I can use this, but I'll be downloading it each time for each server, okay? Because we're not storing it in the CVA. But if I use the software repository, think of that as your local site-specific repo. We've already added the firmware link. We did that in the system side of the house, and there's that There's that firmware. Okay, that's out there on my IMM transition tool share. It could be any share, but that's a cool tool. Works really well and it's super quick. So if you need a file share in a bind, you can't beat downloading it free and installing in less than 5 minutes, and boom, it's right there. So click next, and I do in fact have utility storage on this server, and I'm not going to upgrade it. I actually borrowed it for this demo, so I'm not going to actually change anything. But too easy, okay, to do firmware operations. You also can do server profiles, right, for standalone C-Series servers. Okay, so in that case, I could create a firmware policy, go to server, and go to firmware, give it a name, and you have the option of picking standalone server. So I can click next there, and I can basically select my firmware version. And since I'm in the connected virtual appliance, I'm going to get access to this. Um, otherwise, you're going to need to use the local repo. In the case of PVA, you don't, or use what you've downloaded and uploaded to the PVA repo. Okay, but you have the option of doing policy based too, because we can do standalone server profiles and Intersight. Okay, and they don't really qualify for IMM because there's no FIs involved. So technically, it's not Intersight managed mode. No fabric interconnects, but we still do server policy and server profiles for standalone C-Series servers, and you can certainly use a firmware policy for your standalone servers. So direct endpoint or firmware policy. And that concludes our third demonstration. Okay, that completes our video today about firmware upgrades covering not only IMM, but also UCSM managed mode standalone C-Series with a healthy dose of appliance information sprinkled in throughout. I hope you were able to learn something from this. I know it was a long video, so kudos to those who endured. Appreciate it. But hopefully, both experts and novice alike picked up some pointers here. Stay tuned for more Intersight Managed Mode Expert Series videos, and a heartfelt thank you.